on today's Story Beat.
So here's a piece of advice, and didn't come from me. It came from Larry Gordon, who was the producer of K-9, Die Hard, 48 Hours. Larry said, if you write a page a day, that's 2 screenplays in 1 year. You do a month story prep, 4 months to write 120 pages, and a month to rewrite. Then you're into that's 6 months. Then you do that for another. So there really is no excuse.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on Story Beat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, the noted screenwriter and teacher Scott Myers, has written over 30 movie and TV projects at almost every major Hollywood studio and broadcast network. Scott's screenwriting credits include K-9, Alaska, and Trojan War. Since 2008, Scott has hosted GoIntoTheStory.com, the official screenwriting blog of The Blacklist, which was named the best of the best scriptwriting website by Writer's Digest magazine. He's also the author of the book, The Protagonist Journey, an introduction to character-driven screenwriting and storytelling. Scott is currently an assistant professor of screenwriting at DePaul University. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a fantastic honor and a real pleasure for me to have the brilliant writer Scott Myers join me on StoryBeat today. Scott, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm not sure anyone's ever called me brilliant, but I'll take that plaudit from you. Thanks.
Well, I think you're pretty brilliant. So anyway, all right. So let's go back in time a little bit, and I'm just wondering, where did all of this desire to write fiction and creative work and screenplays, where did it begin?
Well, I took a circuitous route to it, Steve. I mean, I'm not a USC film graduate. I didn't anticipate getting into it. My father was an Air Force colonel.
Right.
So I'm a military brat. We moved all over to, I used to say, why didn't you go in the Navy? We could have been in San Diego or San Francisco. No, we were in places like Minot, North Dakota for 4 years, But moving around like that was interesting because you get to see all these different subcultures. And my brother was quite a bit older than me, so I was almost like an only child. I spent a lot of time alone reading, thinking, and writing stuff. At 14, I started, my parents, to their chagrin, got me a guitar. And I started being a songwriter. And so that's where I took off after going to graduate school. I went to University of Virginia undergraduate, studied religious studies. I was very interested in theology and the big questions of life.
Oh, the perfect entree into Hollywood.
Exactly. and then I went to Yale Divinity School. So I got a master's of divinity degree.
Wow.
Yeah, I was going to get a PhD in theological studies, but because of the music, the songwriting, I had this sense in my gut that I just, if I turned my back on the creative thing, I was going to be frustrated about that. So I took off a year and did that. I played music for 7 years professionally. I mean, that's how I made a living. I did stand-up comedy for 2 years for reasons that are still befuddle me.
Really?
Yeah. But that's how I discovered screenwriting. I was playing in a nightclub in Ventura, California, and the owner of the club was actually going to the Peter Stark film producing program at USC. And that very day, that exact day, the project he had, the script project he had as part of his thesis, where you need to budget it and market it and all that stuff, had gotten optioned.
Wow.
And so we had always talked about movies. I should say parenthetically that I grew up in movie theaters. When you're in the Air Force, an Air Force brat, they subsidized that. So I could go for like 50 cents, 75 cents and see movies. And when you're in North Dakota, nothing else to do, that's what I would do. So I've always had a love affair with movies. He jokingly said to me, well, maybe you could write a screenplay. And I said, I can do that. And I'd never seen one, never read one, but I knew I loved movies and I knew how to tell a story.
Was that a case? I've had many people in my life think that because they've seen a lot of movies and TV shows, writing a movie would be easy because it looks kind of easy. It looks like fun. Well, it is fun, but it looks easy to do. Was that the case for you, where you thought, yeah, I can do that? That shouldn't be too hard to do.
I had no idea, honestly. Steve. I mean, this has been the kind of basis of my life in many respects, has been what Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. I just pursued my passion, and that led to things. That's always been that case. I had no idea. I mean, I literally had no idea. All I knew was that I loved movies like a lot. And as soon as I read, like, he gave me 3 scripts: Back to the Future, Breaking Away, and Witness.
Okay.
And as soon as I read them, I went, that's it. That's what I want to do. I mean, I just knew it because it was perfect for me. I as a songwriter, you have structure, verse, chorus, bridge, verse. So I understood the structural stuff pretty quickly. I wound my way into it.
And there's a kind of poetry to writing a song. Obviously, it's not true poetry, but it's kind of poetry. And so you understood the language in a way other than just talking normally to other people.
Yes, that's true. There's also, you mentioned the word poetry. Frankly, I think that when we write scene description or action description in scripts, it's better to think of it as poetry than prose, because there's that real focus on individual word. Well, you know this, right?
Sure.
The minimum words, maximum impact. That's what I tell my student. That's what screenwriting is. Minimum words, maximum impact.
Terse and colorful.
Same thing with poetry.
Terse and colorful.
To the point, lean. That's exact. Terse and colorful, but lean. So the descriptors and stuff. Having done that with songs, where you labor over every word, similar to poetry, I was used to that, and I've always brought that sensibility to the writing.
So was your training reading scripts? Was that how you learned how to write scripts?
So I was very fortunate. I mean, like, the 3rd script I wrote, in fact, yesterday was the 35th anniversary of when I found out that, well, at the time, Fox said they wanted to buy the spec script K9, but that was 35 years ago today. I got on the phone and my wife said, Fox wants to buy it.
Wow.
Universal ended up buying it. But I was very lucky because of that. And then I had an overall deal with Warner Brothers. So for about the first 4 or 5 years, I was really not terribly well schooled in the craft, and I just immersed myself in everything. And reading scripts was absolutely a critical part of it. I still, to this day, have breakdowns, scene by scene breakdowns of scripts that I read way back when.
So I want to go back.
Movies.
I want to go back a half a step, because you said something curious to me. You were trying to figure out how to write scripts, right? But you had an overall deal at Warner Brothers. How did that happen?
Well, this speaks to the power. This speaks to the power of concepts, story concepts, and I mean, K9 was not a great script, but it was an effective script, and everybody saw the commercial possibilities of it. You can describe it very quickly. Loner cop, new partner, police dog, boom. Everybody in Hollywood got that. And so we went and had a meeting with Rodney Dangerfield's people. They all have their people, right? Rodney's people. And we were talking to the exec. I walked out of there with my partner and I said, well, I know, because I did stand-up comedy. So I know Rodney Dangerfield. His whole shtick is, I don't get no respect. I don't get any respect. I said, well, what gig would be the greatest gig in the world for someone who doesn't get any respect? Rodney Dangerfield, Mr. President. So I went back to our agents and they said, you got to do, They set up a meeting at Warner Brothers. We came in with a very well constructed type script pitch, and they said, boom, they bought it. And based off that, they then extended that into an overall deal. So, I mean, I just worked like crazy those first several years. I read everything. I saw everything. I was going to like 4 movies a day. I was going to every public function of any screenwriter I could find, and, reading the LA Times, all the trades voluminously, but mainly reading scripts. I just read script after script after script and studied them, broke them down, and absorbed the voice of the various writers and structure and all that stuff. So yeah, that was my film school education, was like literally just watching and reading.
So I think it's important for the listeners, especially those of you out there who are trying to figure out whether you can be a writer and whether you can get into the industry and so on. It's very important that you listen to what Scott just said, and that is he immersed himself in it. It wasn't just a wish. You really dug deep into it. You went to lots of movies and read a lot of scripts, and there's no substitute for that.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. There is absolutely no substitute for that. Yeah, film school is great for certain people, and I teach them, and I'm very proud of what we do. But even there, I'm constantly telling my students, you got to read scripts, you got to watch movies, you got to watch TV, as well as pounding out pages.
Well, that's the other part of it. You got to pound out the pages, that's for sure.
Well, I came up with this little mantra years ago, Steve, which like Franklin Leonard is the head of the Blacklist. Whenever anybody ever asks him, well, how do I get into the film business? What do I need to do? He says, just do what Scott says. Watch movies, read scripts, write pages. Those three things. Watch movies, read scripts, write pages.
Well, that's the old joke, isn't it? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? You practice.
Yeah, exactly. You got to have a passion for it, and you got to just immerse yourself in it. And
so how many hours?
My film school.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say my film school class right now, we're reading one a week. Now these are working on their thesis script, so they're very busy and they got other classes. But every week we're reading a 2021 Blacklist script and breaking it down and discussing it, just because I want them to be in the habit of reading current material. So yeah, it's really critical.
It's completely critical. Well, so when you're in a writing phase, when you're really writing, how many hours a day do you go at it?
Well, so I'm writing a spec right now, a comedy. I haven't written a comedy in a long time. And so it's a little different because I'm also teaching. Now, when I was full-time living in LA for, nearly 2 decades and writing those 30 plus projects, I had a habit of basically writing from 1 to 5 every afternoon. I had a little thing, 1 to 5, 5 to 7. I'd write either from 1 to 5, or if I'm writing a draft, 5 to 7 pages, whichever came first. If I pounded out 7 pages in 3 hours, I said, okay, that's it, but that's just the actual physical writing time. Now, if there's research and breaking story and character development, then that could extend easily in from the morning into the night, so, but now, because I'm working full-time as an assistant professor, it's the mornings where I just focus on the writing. So
that's when you have time, because you teach in the afternoon.
Teach in the afternoon, teach at night for the MFA students. Yeah.
Right. So, all right. So you mentioned a couple of things that I think are absolutely critical. When you are developing a story, which is first for you? Plot, character? What comes first typically? Okay.
Well, so my book is called The Protagonist Journey, an Introduction to Character-Driven Screenwriting and Storytelling. So that should be
there's a clue.
Tip right there.
That's a clue.
There's a clue. I absolutely, this is one thing I've discovered in 35 years of doing this and interviewing hundreds of writers on my blog and whatnot, and just teaching as I have, the best writing is character-driven writing, because stories emerge from the characters, in particular the protagonist. And so that's where we start. I have a story prep class I created online years ago. I've used that to create an undergraduate and graduate level story development class here at DePaul that starts with characters and ends with characters, and we find the story in between. And so I'm a huge proponent of starting with character, because character is plot. The choices they make, the decisions they make, the actions they take, that all comes from inside.
You're talking about the great difference between drama and melodrama. And the drama is characters drive the plot, and melodrama, the plot drives the characters. And there's no question that I think the greatest stories we know are character driven, exactly what you're saying. Though Hollywood is driven mostly by melodrama.
Yes. I used to teach a class called The History of American Screenwriting. And so melodrama has got quite a prominent place in the history of Hollywood. Absolutely.
You
but
don't
if
have
you think
you
of-
don't have James Bond without Melodrama.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I, you know, like I studied Joseph Campbell when I was in college and in graduate
Sure.
school, and then I discovered Carl Jung, because Carl Jung was a huge influence, you know, the founder of analytical psychology,
mhm.
huge influence on Campbell. I think it's fair to say that Campbell may not have ever landed on the hero's journey like he did had he not known about Carl Jung. Carl Jung talks about the individuation process. That's our task as human beings, to find our individual selves,
Right.
and that we move toward wholeness. That's our goal, wholeness, he calls it. And if you think about the protagonist's journey in most movies, that's it. The protagonist is starting off in what I call a state of disunity,
Mhm.
and generally speaking, they move toward a state of unity. Now, that to Jung, that's the great adventure of life. That's the task, is that we are to engage our entire psyche and learn all about ourselves, all aspects of that, including the shadow, the dark, negative impulses. And that way is the only way that we can, by going into ourselves, we can have that outer journey to discovery of who we are. Campbell talks about this too. Everybody thinks of Campbell with, you know, because of the writer's journey, which is a wonderful book, you know, the 12 stages and all that. Campbell's point was that he says, this is literally a quote, the external journey, the outer journey is incidental to the inner journey.
Right.
The inner journey is the most important thing. That's why his thing was that the whole point of the hero's journey is transformation. So it's all about the character and what they're going through. That's where I come from.
Well, you can't have a classic character arc without going inside.
No, absolutely you can't. And so now there are stories where characters refuse to change. There are
Sure.
stories where they go through a negative change. There are stories where there are change agents, like Wally is a change agent and Forrest Gump is a change agent. They don't change, they change others. But change is there, whether they go through a change or not.
Sure.
It's at the heart of story. I mean,
Well-
that's just like essence.
Well, infamously, there's an entire famous television series called Seinfeld, in which the mantra was "no hugging, no changing." No growth.
Yeah, now
no
that's a
growth
perfect-
is what it was.
No growth, none whatsoever in those characters. That's
Right.
sort of their charm.
Well, that is their charm, and that's where the humor comes from, is that they don't seem to, they never go past where they started, which is actually brilliant. I mean, but you can't do that in every show, and you certainly can't do that in drama or even in melodrama. You've got to have the characters grow somewhat. So do you have a particular method for developing characters? What do you do to develop a character that doesn't exist?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Stephen, you know this because you yourself are a writer. There's a kind of a magic about it, right?
Mhm. Sure.
Where they exist, the characters exist, that story universe exists. Now, you know, we as a writer may conjure it up. You know, it may hit us. We're out for a walk, or we're sitting around doodling or whatever, and we see these things kind of come together. But in a way, the more alive they become to us, that reflects the fact that in some mystical way they exist. So if you act on that assumption, then the key is curiosity, is just reaching out to them. and learning-
Curiosity. Your curiosity or the character's
Yes.
curiosity?
No, your curiosity is the writer.
Okay.
And so how we start it is this: a protagonist character treatment, 8 questions. That's what we start. Who's the protagonist? That's a critical question.
Critical.
You know, the whole story can change just by depending upon who that character is. Next 2 questions, for anybody who's trafficked in screenwriting world will get these questions. I didn't come up with them. You know, what do they want? What do they need? The difference I do there is that I say, okay, let's get specific about that though. They may enter the story with a generalized sense of want or need, but by the end of Act 1, in most movies, there's a conscious goal. That's the want has become defined. They want this, and so they're moving toward that. Now, there are movies, of course, where they don't have a clear goal, and there are movies where their goal, like Jimmy Stewart and George Bailey, It's a Wonderful Life, never left Bedford Falls, but he discovered something, more important in himself.
But he
through the
did. But
friendship.
he did have a goal. His goal was he wanted to get out of Bedford Falls,
Get out, and he never did.
and he never does.
Yeah.
But in not getting out, his resolution to all that is to find out he had a wonderful life.
He had to go inside.
Yeah, he had to go in. Sure.
He had to go inside to discover that. Right. So, and that was the brilliant insight that Clarence the Angel had. Yeah. Wish you'd never been born, huh? Okay. So let's check that out. So that drives that question of need, which oftentimes is a, sort of a generalized sense. Again, I push people. I say, what is the deepest need? What's their unconscious goal? And that's really what drives the story, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what I call the narrative imperative. The protagonist, the journey they go on is the journey they have to go on. They have to go on that journey.
It's inevitable.
There is an inevitability about it. Yes. So that's why I'm saying once you start to tap into the characters, that informs everything. So who's the protagonist? What do they want? What do they need? What's their conscious goal? What's their unconscious goal? That to me is the most important question, because if you can dig down so deep that's inside them already, that's Jung and Campbell, same thing. It's in there already. You follow your bliss.
So how do you get to that? Is it just a lot of pounding out trying to figure out who they are, or do you sit around and conjure it up? How do you get to those decisions, those understandings, those epiphanies?
So we have these 8 questions we do with the protagonist character treatment. And then the most important part of the process, and this is way before you even get to page writing, brainstorming, character development. And so I've developed this approach and have taught it to, over 1,000 writers and at all levels. It's in my book. It's part 3 of my book. Is you do these indirect engagement exercises and direct engagement exercises. The indirect engagement exercises are where you're thinking about the character. And so these will be familiar probably to most writers, like a set of questionnaires, questions you ask, a biography. You've learned a little bit. And so now you're speculating about why the character, what their background is. And then a free scene. Just after you've done some work there, put a character in and another character and just see what happens. Those are indirect. You're thinking about the character. The direct engagement exercises is where the real diamonds show up. And that's going from something like what I call an interview, where my favorite is I'm the psychiatrist, the character is my client, and I can ask this character any question in the world, and eventually they have to answer that. So I'm doing this. Again, getting curious. I'm just asking questions. I learned a technique at Yale when I went to graduate school that the therapists use. You reframe anything someone says as a question. So let's say, for example, I'm doing an interview with a character. How are you feeling today, Chet? Oh, I'm okay. Oh, you saying you sound okay? Maybe not a little okay. Well, yeah, I had some problems with my boss at work. Oh, so you had a difficult day at work? Just a difficult day. My boss, he's a real jerk. Oh, so your boss he's not a very good guy to you? So you keep repeating back to them as a question, because you're affirming what they say and then inviting them to dig a little more deeply into who they are.
Interesting.
So those interviews are great. I mean, I've had people tell me, oh, this is so silly, Scott. Really, you want me to, you're asking me to believe that? Yeah, try it. Just try it. There's no downside. I mean, if it doesn't work, great. Then set it aside. I've had people come back and, oh my God, Scott, you can't believe it. I've had like 4 interviews. I've gone on dates with this character. I mean, literally, I've had a woman say, I've been on 3 dates with him. But then you go even deeper. And now this gets into the real woo-woo stuff of writing, where this again, direct engagement. Now you're going into the characters. And so there are these 2 ways you can do this. It's like meditation. You close the door, turn off the phone, get a fingers and keyboard or pad of paper and pen, close your eyes, do some deep breathing, get the character in your mind. It's like a Vulcan mind meld, Spock, right? Where they're in your head, you're in their head.
Sure.
You set the timer for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and you just start typing. You just type, blind type. You're trying to get in, whether you want to call it your subconscious or the character's mental state, whether it's a monologue, that's one way of doing it. You're just hearing what they're saying, or it's a stream of consciousness. You just type. And then, of course, just like meditation, there'll be times where you go, oh, I got to do this with the cat, or I got to get the car's tire fixed or whatever. Yeah, you just let that go. You just come back to the character. You're always coming, just like in meditation, you come back to the breathing. In this, you come back to the character. You keep coming back to the character. Now you get done with this thing, 15, 20 minutes, and you're looking at what you've got. And most of it probably looks like gobbledygook, right?
Right.
But you know what? There's like some interesting stuff there. Where did that come? Why is a yellow umbrella so important? What is it? An incident with a chocolate milkshake? I don't. In this, there's a sense of gloom over some event that happened on a football field. Well, where is that coming from? Well, now you can go back and do an interview. Get that character and say, hey, was there something about a football field for you? Right? So you see what I'm saying? It's like they're and you're bouncing back and forth. There's no chronology to it. You just follow your gut. Like sometimes you're going, you know what, this isn't working. I'm going to go back and do a biography. But then there are other times you're going, wow, this other character popped up. I was working with character A, character B showed up. You drop character A, you go to character B. This character B is now saying to you, I want to talk to you. I want to. So it really is just, it's an invitation. It's like metaphorically, you're extending your hand to the character saying, all right, I'm here. I trust you want me to tell your story. That's otherwise you wouldn't be here. I am an advocate for you. I want to tell your story.
Are
so
you
here
like,
I am reaching out my hand.
Are you like many creators, not just writers, but creators in general, where it seems to you that whatever it is that you're creating is coming through you? You're the conduit for something that is already in the ether, so to speak.
That's such a great question. And I don't know if there's an answer. I mean, like this project I'm working on right now, it's a comedy. I mean, and it's, it's going to be funny, but it's going to be grounded in the psychological nature of the characters. And so I just, like 10 days ago, spent an entire day with one of the two lead characters.
Right.
And I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I went through these same exercises. I took what I'd known in, conjuring it up. I'm working with a writing partner. We kind of conjured up some stuff. And I said, all right, well, let me just start there. Started thinking about biographical things. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, I need to interview the character. And so that went to that. And then I did what I call the character sit down, the monologue, the stream of consciousness. I don't know. Is it as I was saying, I don't know. Is it my subconscious? Is it them? Am I coming up with it? Are they coming up with it and funneling through me? I don't really know. All I know is that I believe they exist, and that somehow in that process of I trust that they're going to open up to me, and I do that in good faith, and I'm curious and respect them, even the nemesis characters. I want to find their humanity too.
100%.
That somehow that stuff shows up.
The greatest antagonists, well, Leo Tolstoy, I've said this on the show before, Leo Tolstoy once famously said, the best stories come from good versus good. And so when your antagonists, your villains, whoever are someone that the audience roots for, that makes the conflict between the two characters or three characters, whatever it is, that much more intense.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Well, there's a quote from somebody, I don't know who it was, it said, even bad guys have moms.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
It's that there, so if you can find the humanity in a nemesis or an antagonist figure, what that does is it not only allows you to have an avenue into them at a deeper level, way beyond stereotype. If you can communicate that on the page, then you do something really interesting with the audience. You shrink the distance between them and the bad guy.
Sure.
Because now all of a sudden they can relate.
Well,
they can relate.
Well,
and that makes for a much more interesting psychological dynamic.
It's really important for the audience in some way to empathize with the bad guy.
Absolutely. My perfect example is Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs.
Sure.
He's a psychopath. He kidnaps women, he starves them, he skins them, and he's making this skin suit. He's going to this female skin suit because he believes he should be a woman. That's his whole misconception. He was turned down at the sex change places, the three of them. So he's a psychopath, clearly. But he wants to change. He feels uncomfortable in his skin. He feels out of place. Well, who among us hasn't had those feelings?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, he's crazy. But there's a way in which we can relate to that because we feel a certain, not sympathy, but empathy, because we've all had some of those same experiences.
Well, I'm a great believer in character empathy. If the audience does not empathize, especially with your protagonist, but as you say, with your nemesis, if they don't empathize in some way, they lose feeling for it.
And at the end of the day, that's what you want.
Right.
You want an emotional response.
Visceral, for sure.
Right.
For sure.
And so if you can do that, where there's a phrase I learned, I don't know where I picked it up in, the early days of Hollywood, but that sense of audience identification, particularly with the protagonist, that the audience identifies with the protagonist and they're going to live vicariously through the exploits of the protagonist.
For sure.
Right. So yeah, that empathy is key to that. If you can establish a level of empathy or even sympathy with a protagonist character, then boom, people are on, they're along for the ride.
Well, like you, I've been teaching for some time. And one of the things that I notice in a lot of newer writers is it's very challenging for them sometimes to figure out, as they're developing a story, who their lead character is, who's the person we're supposed to follow, whose story is it, who has the arc. And sometimes there are 2 or 3 or 4 characters and they're all sort of angling for the attention, and the audience gets lost because they don't know who to empathize with or who to follow or what are we supposed to be rooting for.
I think that's one of the reasons, Steve, why in Hollywood, at least this has been my experience, they prefer, or let's just say the path of least resistance as far as the development executives are concerned, is they prefer stories with a single protagonist. It's just much easier for the audience to have a focused experience by living vicariously through one character.
And it's a lot easier to sell from a marketing perspective.
And to attract A-level talent, right?
100%.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have that. But those are good questions. I mean, if I had a student saying, I don't know who the protagonist is in the story, I'd say, well, okay, good. That's just, first of all, congratulations on recognizing that. So here's what I'm going to encourage you to do. I want you to spend a day with each of these 4 characters as if each were the protagonist. Like, do the same exact exercises you would do for the protagonist development that we were just talking about with each of these characters. And at some point, it's going to be clear. The ironic thing, of course, is that every character feels they are the protagonist in their story because they are in their own story.
They're the protagonist of their own story, for sure.
But who drives it? That's the thing.
Exactly.
If there's a character that's driving the story, and now oftentimes that means in opposition to the nemesis, because the nemesis oftentimes has a plan, that's setting the whole plot line into motion. But yeah, that's what I would say to the student is just, you got to live with the characters and over time trust that perspective is going to emerge. Now it could be a co-protagonist story where some buddy comedies where they're 2 characters along one journey, or it could be a dual protagonist story. I'd say this Shawshank Redemption is that, where they're engaged with each other's lives, but they have different paths that they take. I mean, why else would the story continue with Red for another 8 minutes after Andy's already gone? It's not just Andy's story, it's Red's story too. So but generally speaking, I'd say that, yeah, even in movies like Ocean's 11, it's Ocean.
Well,
Ocean. He's the protagonist, right?
You've got Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You've got Thelma and Louise. You've got 48 Hours. You've got all these buddy comedies, buddy shows, and so on. And who's the lead? I maintain that one of those characters typically has the arc. They're the ones that have the want going to the need, and that is your protagonist, even though they're both sort of equals, or maybe they're playing 2 sides of one coin. So I think that's what you're talking about is absolutely spot on. I mean, you've got characters who the audience must still empathize with, and then one of them is the driving force, so to speak. Yes,
I'd say that's the path of least resistance. I mean, I think I always tell people, look, there's no right way to write a story.
Of course not.
Right. But if you want to, I think, fall into the comfort zone of managers, agents, producers, development executives, You give them a single protagonist story where they've got a clear goal. They're going after something. Here's a nemesis or antagonist character. That right there puts them in a very comfortable spot because they just know that that's easy to sell, and they're comfortable probably in developing that because of that dynamic. So,
all right, so let's talk about story for a moment, because here's how we've got our characters. We've spent a long time developing them. We've interrogated them. We've interviewed them. We've chatted with them. And now we know who the characters are. All right, how do you begin to write a story? Where does that come from?
Okay, so this is the main reason I wrote the book. I was approached by Palgrave Macmillan, the publishing company. I had another idea for a book I wanted to write, and they were like, well, why don't you do something like this? Because it seems like there's a gap. A lot of the how-to books focus on structure as plot. This happens here, this happens here. My point is that, well, yeah, plot's important, but there's a whole other half to the story, the psychological journey. You've got the physical journey and through space and time. The psychological journey is critical, and that, in my view, the protagonist's inner journey drives that whole thing. So you've done this work, protagonist character treatment. You've done all this work where you're doing character development, not just with the protagonist, but all these different characters. You got all this stuff. You've created what I call a master brainstorming file or a master brainstorming list. Mine tend to run over 100 pages.
Wow.
That's where I do all the character development and plotting, and I just put it all. My writing partner right now in this project, we have a Google Doc. We're just like 2.5 weeks into it, and it's already over 50 pages. So we do all this work. Well, plot stuff comes out of that. So the next stage is I say, all right, let's figure out 4 primary plotline points. I had an old dude when I was picketing 20th Century Fox in the strike in 1988 who said, Scott, you got to have 4 things to have a story, a script, movie. You got to know what's the opening, what's the end of Act 1, what's the end of Act 2, and what's the ending. He said, you don't got that. He said, you don't got dick. That's what he told me. So I said, I like that. I always thought, and if you think about it,
he was right.
Well, it's like Aristotle, because you got beginning, middle, and end. Well, you got those little buffers in there. You got something between the beginning and the middle. Well, that's the end of Act 1. And you got something between the middle and the end, and that's the end of Act 2. So you got those 4 primary plotline points. So I say, okay, let's take a stab at it. We may not know what they are now, but what's your sense of the opening? What's your sense of that end of Act 1? And not necessarily the scenes themselves, but just like, what is the character decided? What is the protagonist? Are they willingly going on this journey? Are they unwillingly going on this journey? What is their goal if they have one? What is their conscious goal? And then off you go into the journey. That end of Act 2, the big reversal, you want to put them on their heels where they came close, where they're moving toward their goal, but boom, thing sets them on their ass. And what's great about that is not only does the audience going, oh my God, so what's going to happen? From an emotional standpoint, you're forcing the protagonist to say, who am I? Who am I? Am I the person that's grown in Act 2, gone through what I call a process of deconstruction, which is like crushing and breaking down the old ways of being, the way they started to live before fade in, and moving into reconstruction, where they're now relying on this inner need that's bubbling up. What do you call it? True self, authentic nature. It's inside. Remember Glinda the Good Witch? Dorothy, you've always had the power to go home. It was inside the whole time. That's what Jung believes. It's in there already. Which access it.
Which, by the way, ticks off a lot of people, because why didn't she tell her that in the beginning?
Because she answers. Scarecrow says, well, why didn't you tell her that in the beginning? She says, she wouldn't have believed me. She had to go through this journey in order to discover it.
That's
right?
true.
I mean, it's like literally right there in the dialogue. And so again, the journey they take is the journey they need to take. They got to take this journey in order to become who they need to become. So there's that reconstruction process, and they're making progress. They're getting in touch with this stuff. They're learning stuff, intellectual stuff from a mentor. They're learning emotional stuff from attractor characters, part of these archetypes that exist in these stories. All is lost. Big reversal. Who am I? Am I going to go forward against all the odds based upon what I've gotten in touch with in terms of my understanding, my self-understanding? Or I could go back to where I was at the beginning. It was an inauthentic life. It was not the life I was supposed to be leading, but it was safe. And I know I could continue to live there. And of course, because it's a movie, they're going to go forward.
Have to.
So then those 4 plot line points, but then we follow that, Steve. The next stage is right. Okay, so now you're talking about what I call the plot line, the external world, action and dialogue, moving through physical space. Yeah, that's what most people think of screenplays, is they focus on that. Now we go to the inner world. You got the external world, you got the internal world. You got plot line, you got theme line. You got the physical world, you got the psychological world. You've got dialogue, we know subtext, right? It's the meaning of the words. You got action, well, what are motivations? What are their intentions? And so now you go and you look at the protagonist. And in most stories, they go through a unity arc. They start off in disunity and they end up in unity. They go through disunity, deconstruction, reconstruction, unity. And so I have them go, all right, describe those 4 movements. I call them 4 theme line movements. Disunity, deconstruction, reconstruction, unity. What's going on there? Every scene that happens, every moment that occurs, there's something that happens in the plot, but there's something that happens underneath. And it all contributes to the protagonist in particular, their growth and their development. So that all the events, every character they intersect with is feeding and motivating the protagonist's character arc. There's a synergy there. There's a sympathetic, a synthesis between what goes on in the plot and what goes on in the inner life. But you've got to spend time down here. And so we constantly, like with this writing project I'm doing now, I'm saying, well, why, what would they do right here? Why are we thinking this? No, what is going on with the character? We just always go back to the character. Where are they right now? I tell my students all the time, you're having problems in the scene. It's not the logistics of the scene. It's the characters. You don't understand where they're at. And so we spend time doing that. And then we expand from 4 plot line points into 10, just because every 10 pages or so, you want something to happen of some substance. And then we come up and work a scene by scene outline. And so that's how you do it. You start off though with the protagonist character treatment. By the end of the project, I tell my students, you're going to get there. You're going to have a scene by scene outline, but it's going to be infused with and driven by your understanding of the characters. So you can tell I'm passionate about this. I'm sorry.
I love it. I stand by my original assertion that you're brilliant. That is brilliant, what you just described. So you get to an outline. You believe in outline.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I think outline is nothing more than an assessment, an articulation of a character's growth and their interface with the real world. It's like the actions they take, the decisions they make, the things they do, all is tied to their movement, whether they're nudged forward, yanked forward, inched forward. They're going from their inauthentic life to their authentic life, from disunity to unity, from them getting in touch with that inner need, the deepest need that they have. That's their unconscious goal, whatever that is. There's layers of needs, not just one thing. It's not just overcoming a flaw, which you sometimes see. What's their wound? Yeah, they got wounds, they got flaws. What's deep down there? Dorothy needs to discover that the home that she didn't think was a home in Kansas is her home. She knew it all along, but she needed to go through the journey to do that.
Well, there's no place like home.
No place. That's where it ends, right? There's no place like home.
It's one of the few movies where they actually tell you the theme of the movie in the last line of the movie. They actually flat out just tell you the theme.
Yeah, that's true. There are a few, like I can think of Tootsie, right? Where he says, I was a better, basically, I can't remember the exact quote, but I was a better man as a woman than I was as a man.
Exactly.
Which is, he was a sexist. He was a misogynist at the beginning. He was like hitting on women.
Sure.
So the journey is obvious for him. If you're being a jerk to women, what better way for you to get in touch with your feminine side? It's in there. Remember, at some points he's going, I don't know, Dorothy, I don't think would like that. It's going to look a little frumpy. He's getting in touch with his feminine side, his female persona, his anima spirit for Jung. And at the end, I was a better man as a woman.
Well, that's what he needs. He needs to stop what he was and become this better person.
Narrative imperative. That's why I say the journey they go on is the journey they need to take. And we see this in movie after movie. There's a great quote, which I basically, that sense of, how I'm talking about, when you watch a movie and you get to the end, you go, wow, that was both surprising and inevitable. It's
It-
like, I really like how they got there, but boy, when they landed it, you go, yeah, that's exactly where they needed to land.
there's nothing better than a movie that is, there's no other way it should have concluded or resolved. That's inevitable. And yet you're correct. It's the best of all worlds when you don't see it coming, but it's all laid out there for you. I think one of the great examples of that is The Sixth Sense, which I don't know how I'm sure you've seen it. I don't know how you saw it when you first saw it. I didn't see it coming. I didn't get it.
No
Some
idea.
people got it, but I didn't get it. And when he reaches for that knob, it's like, holy mackerel. And then you think that can't possibly be all there. And then you go watch it a second time and it's all there. It's right in front of you the whole time. So it's inevitable.
That was a brilliant, that's still my favorite Shyamalan movie. I mean, I just
Wow.
thought he was so restrained in directing it, and but you're exactly right. And again, now that's interesting. There's an anecdote, I think it's true, where he didn't realize that Malcolm Crowe was dead until the fifth draft. The original version of the
Wow.
story was Malcolm Crowe was a cop investigating a serial killer, and he was using the kid who is a seer, like a psychic, to try and
Right.
figure out some clues. But the fifth draft, this is where you got to trust the process, right? He said, wait a minute, my protagonist is dead. And so that's where that all, so, his unconscious goal, well, yeah, he needed to learn that he was dead. But more than that, he needed to learn that he had been so obsessed with work that he had not really paid as much attention to his wife as he needed to. And so, anyhow, yeah.
All right. So
The
when you
Sixth Sense.
develop an outline, about how many beats would you say are in an outline? How many scenes would you say typically? Is it 50, 60 scenes? Is it 70 scenes?
See, that depends. It's like, if it's an action movie, and I don't write a lot of them, but I have written some action comedies, you're going to have probably more scenes because you're going to just have, a lot more action going on. But then I wrote I wish it had gotten made. It came so close to getting made. We had an Academy Award winning actress attached, and some things went south on it. But that was a much, more languorous type thing where you've got character drama kind of thing. So there's not really a typical, thing. I know this, my outlines tend to run 25, 30, 35 pages, all single space. Like I put everything in there. I put lines of dialogue, transitions in and out of scenes. We'll do the same thing on this project. We're going to come up with a scene by scene outline. So basically by the time you get, that's all the hard work.
That is all the hard work. Once you have an outline that's any good, then you really are way down the road.
So now some people I know, now this may come as a surprise, but I tell my students, I say, okay, when you get the outline done, set it aside. Set it aside. When you're writing, I don't want you to look at the outline. I figure that you're going to have carried with you the important stuff from the outline. Now, there may be times where you get a little confused and you want to drift back to it, but I think it's much more, the work of getting the outline together is really about inscribing the story in your soul. And so when I tell my students, I want you to come from a feeling place in that first draft. I don't want you thinking like, okay, I'm going to rudimentary do this, ABC scene thing. No, get in touch with each character before the thing, do some deep breathing, transition out of this world into that, and just feel your way through the writing. So the outline is important, but it's also it's a piece of the puzzle to get the thing moving forward.
All right. So you've got a 25 or 30 page outline that you've now set aside. So you're going to start from page 1 on your script, probably. Some people do bump around. I know writers that write various scenes from different parts of a story, but I start in the beginning, and most writers I know start in the beginning. And you start to write. Typically about how long does it take you to knock out a first draft?
Well, this is where it seems counterintuitive to say, wait a minute, I'm going to spend all this time on an outline when I've got how it is in Hollywood. If you have a feature, you got maybe 12 weeks or whatever contractually to turn it in. So, but it expedites things. I mean, if you've broken the story, you understand the characters, the flow of you can pound out 30 pages in an afternoon or a day. You're just in the flow. So I always prided myself on hitting deadlines. Now this process, because this particular script I'm working on now, based on a great concept, that's the reason I'm doing it. It's just I came up with this idea, and it's a wonderful high concept but it's got a nice little character component to it. But I've given myself January through June to get through all the rewrites. Because I'm not working as a screenwriter full time. I teach too, so.
Right.
But I'd say once we start writing, we'll probably knock out a first draft in, I don't know, 2-3 weeks.
2-3 weeks. That's right. About 21 days is about all it should probably take you if you've done all the homework.
If you've done all the work. Yeah.
If you have. And then, all right, so let's talk about dialogue for a moment, because obviously we don't write silent movies too often anymore. And though I believe that the best movies are visual, it is a visual medium, and that there's more visual than there is dialogue, but a lot of movies are dialogue driven for one reason or another. What would you say makes great dialogue great? How do you write great dialogue?
First of all, there are these writers who just write great dialogue. August Wilson,
Aaron
Sorkin, right? They're known for their dialogue. And yeah, it's pretty amazing, right? Now, August Wilson, who
that's
I
Shakespeare.
admire.
That's modern Shakespeare.
And there was asked once, because he was teaching at Yale at the end of his life, and he was asked once, well, how do you write such great dialogue? And he said, this is his response, I don't, they do. And when he meant they, he was talking about the characters. He would say, I'd be walking along, and all of a sudden a character from a story I've written 20 years ago pops up. And I'm like, hey, how you doing? And the guy, we just start talking. So there are some people that can get into that place. Now, the work that I'm talking about doing, where we're doing those direct engagement exercises,
right,
that facilitates that, because you are engaging them in an I-you relationship, as opposed to thinking about them. And so I think that's a very helpful way of doing it. But if you go with your feelings and just the first couple of drafts, it's really just, you're letting it. I tell my students, I don't care if you have a 150-page first draft. I'd rather you write long, because you can always cut and trim. I want you to give yourself over to the characters. If the scenes start before they should start or end after they should end, if the characters go on and have a monologue for 20 lines, I don't care. You're feeling it. If you're hearing it, great, go with it. So that's the key, is getting to know the characters and just allowing them to inhabit your creative space.
As long as you don't fall in love with everything that you've written and then you don't know what to cut. You've got to be able to cut.
Well, there's all sorts of language systems about this, Steve, but one of them is there's the receptive writing, where you're there and you're just receiving what's going on. That's that feeling state where you're just knocking out that first draft and you're just receiving it.
It's a purge draft. You get it all out.
Right. Okay. And then you step outside, and then you do that executive writing. Now you're using a different part of your brain. You're going, okay, this dialogue here is fun, but it doesn't really move the story. Conversation with purpose. It's got to move the story forward in some respects. And so you bounce back and forth, the receptive writing, the executive writing, but you need both of them. But it's best to give yourself over to, I think, that feeling stuff first, and then you can tighten and tighten and tighten.
Well, exactly. But you have to be willing. Well, of course, you can go to all these various quotes, but Faulkner, I believe it was, once famously said, you have to be willing to kill your darlings. And sometimes people hang on to what they've written as something precious in some way. And it's not helping the story or the characters, or you're not moving forward. So you have to get rid of things. And sometimes it's hard for people to recognize that. Do you ever find that for yourself, where you hang on to things too long, or are you pretty good at getting rid of stuff when you know it doesn't work?
I'm not very precious at this point.
Yeah,
I think people who've done it for a while, it's like, particularly screenwriting, because look, if a writer is that precious with their content, they should be a novelist.
Sure.
Because you could write the perfect script and all of a sudden they go, well, you know what? We're changing the race or the gender identity of this character.
Or turn that character into a monkey. You never know.
You never know, because you just have to, it's a collaborative business, which means there's a lot of fingers in the pie.
Lots.
But I'm not precious about that stuff. I interviewed a writer who had a script in the 2021 Blacklist, who was a journalist. He did 4-year journalism degree at the University of Wisconsin, I believe, and then was writing newspapers. And that was one of the things he said. He said, when you're a journalist, you learn to write on deadline, which is helpful too if you're a screenwriter. but you're not precious. You're not precious with the words, because it's all in service to the story. You got to tell the story.
Well, for sure.
Yeah.
You've got to tell a story. All right. So you mentioned the blacklist. We haven't talked about that except for, in the most surfacey ways. Explain for those who don't know, what is the blacklist, and tell us about what is go into the story and what is that all about?
Okay. So the blacklist is something, it's a multi-headed entity at this point. And I am affiliated with them, but I don't get paid by them. It's just an association that I have because I respect what they do.
Right.
It started off as simply this. Franklin Leonard was a development executive in Hollywood. He was going away for Christmas, and he just wanted to read great scripts. And so he sent out email to a bunch of his development executive cohorts and said, what are the best unproduced scripts that you this year? Like, what are your favorite unproduced scripts? And so they sent back the responses. He totaled them up, created a PDF and sent it out. That was the first blacklist. I think it was 2004, I think it was. And so what happened was, then it became this thing. Every December, they come out with the annual blacklist, which is the same thing. He just sends out, and I think it's now it's over 300 people that are involved as development executives or whatnot. What are your favorite unproduced scripts? And that could be everything from, like, at one point, Social Network was, one of them, because that was a huge, everybody knew about it. It was going to get made, but it was unproduced, to smaller things like Lars and the Real Girl, which basically got made because it was on the blacklist. So that's one thing, the annual blacklist. And if you make the annual blacklist, that's a big deal. The blacklist is like the premier screenwriting brand in Hollywood, I think is fair to say. Then there's the website, where you can put your script up there, you pay money to have it hosted. There's, it gets these like 2 or 3 page story assessments by their readers. And like, I'm a producer on a project right now. I recommended that the writer put it on the blacklist just to see what happened. Well, as a result of that, we've got another producer on it, and that project's going into Netflix here in the next week or so.
Wow.
Because it did so well. So there's the blacklist website. Again, I don't get paid by the blacklist. I'm not getting a kickback here. It's just a great way, because the reason I liked what Franklin was doing was he's trying to, disrupt the system. You don't have to just be a USC film graduate or UCLA graduate, AFI graduate. You can be anywhere in the world. If you're a writer, put your script on this site. If people like it, boom, there you go. So there's that. Now they also are producing movies. So they're, they just announced, they just started doing a YouTube channel with content that's screenwriting adjacent, I think is what he said. So my blog, I started in 2008, and that's Franklin discovered me through my blog. I just thought, well, John August is the grandfather. His blog, johnaugust.com, is, great. Obviously
tremendous,
he's a terrific writer, and it's a great resource. And of course, there are script notes he does with Craig Mason, terrific resource. I just thought, well, why not do a blog where I track the trades every day? I do all this stuff. Why not just say I'm going to post every day? And it's a site where people can go, screenwriters, and so I have. If it hadn't been for shoulder surgery 2 years ago, I would have been up to 5,000 consecutive days.
Wow.
I was literally like 4,400 days when I had shoulder surgery and I had to quit for two months. So it's a site where you get, news like spec script deals or trends. I analyze the blacklist annual. I interview nickel winners, every nickel winner since 2012. I'm interviewing 11 blacklist screenwriters from 2021. I post those on there. I feature screenwriters. I feature screenplays. I grab interviews and articles and things and put them there because we're the most important people in the process as far as I'm concerned, and we get very little respect in Hollywood.
Well, what do you have without a screenplay?
You got, just like that guy said, you got Dick.
You got Dick, so. Or you have something akin to an improv show.
Yeah. Well, that's fine.
Yeah, but
like when I made a movie at Castle Rock called Alaska, I got to see the dailies for Waiting for Guffman, And you think, oh, that's all improv. Yeah, it's improv, but they've got the story beat out.
Oh,
they know
they
every
know.
scene.
Yeah, they know what they're doing with the story, and then then the dialogue might be improv, but the story itself is figured out.
And
Characters are figured out.
Yeah, they shoot dozens and dozens of takes, so they got all the stuff to draw from.
Of course, sure.
So the Blacklist, I am involved with them in this regard because I fundamentally am an educator, I guess you could say. They have these writing lab, feature writer labs, and I've been involved with every single one of them since the first one in I can't remember, 2014, maybe 2013. Over 20 at this point. And so I'm a mentor and a workshop facilitator. And my blog is the official screenwriting blog of the Blacklist. Again, I don't get paid, but I just like the Blacklist. I like what they do. And I obviously like what I do with my blog. I think it's, helpful.
I think that's very awesome of you to do that and not worry about the money part of it. That's a very interesting thing, because how many people in Hollywood, it's all about the money.
Well, that's okay. People have hit me up for like, can we do associate this or ads on your site? And I've always turned them down. I always wanted to be free because there are people out there. Back in the day, you may remember this, Steve, some of these, keys to selling $1 million spec script, written by someone who was like a reader from,
Exactly.
So there's a lot of people out there willing to take your money. So I said, all right, I'm just going to create this place, free content. If you like it, great. If you don't, no problem, And so that's the blog. It's just, now it's got thousands and thousands of articles at this point.
All right. So I'm going to ask you a question. I ask lots of guests on this show. You may have already answered it through some of what you've said, and we'll see if you have something more to say about it. What, in your opinion, makes a good story good?
Well, I guess I'm just going to default to characters.
Characters.
I'm sorry, it's characters. I mean, if
I had a feeling you were going to say that, but I wanted to ask the question anyway because it's
look, it's a great question. If we find ourselves connected to the characters, that covers a multitude of sins in terms of storytelling. I mean, you could have a story that has flaws, but if we are in love with the characters, that's just going to carry the day. I watched this limited series on HBO Max recently, Station 11. Never heard a thing about it in my life. I had no idea. I just saw that my wife and I love limited series. And so, and it's a little uneven. There are some, some episodes, but man, there are some episodes that just completely gut you. I mean, it's terrific. And I fell in love with the characters. I just fell in love with the characters. And so I would say, to me, the characters are critical. And in the best of all worlds, they are going to inform the story. The story is going to emerge from them. So I would say that.
Well, I think that's an outstanding answer to that question, because it's a mystery, I think, to a huge number of people. And I know that you know this from teaching students, that a huge number of people don't understand what it is that makes something work or good, or how does it impact you in a way that you remember, that's memorable and hits you in a visceral way. I just want to quickly ask you, do you have any particular secrets or techniques or thoughts about the best way to pitch?
Yes. Let's see the character. So yeah, I do this thing with the Blacklist as part of my, and when I came to DePaul, I said, let's rework the way that we think about pitching. And we worked with my faculty, who were fantastic, and we came up with an approach. It's your basic, if you're talking about of course, there's all sorts of pitches. There's everything from the log line elevator type pitch to, all right, before we greenlight this project, we want to know every single beat. And you're going in for an hour and you're doing that.
Sure.
But if you're talking about like the classic,
how do you sell it? How do you sell it? How do you sell it?
All right. They say 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I say 12 minutes, 12 minutes, 5 minutes, act one. And you're focusing on characters, particularly your protagonist. You've got to get the audience, the listener in the room, to connect with the protagonist. What's going on there? Why do we care about this character? Andrew Stanton of Pixar fame has that great TED Talk, which I highly recommend. It's on my blog. I've transcribed it. Make me care. That's the number one thing. of all. If you can make them care, so you make them care about the protagonist. You set out the story universe, the key characters, thumbnail sketch. You don't spend a lot of time. 5 minutes, right? Central conflict. This happens. Boom. Now they're off into their journey. The key to the pitching, as far as I'm concerned, this is the only contribution I think that's of like maybe some unique value from what I say. You never pitch beat for beat in Act 2. What you do is look at those subplots. Subplot equals relationships. You've established the key characters in the story. I happen to think there are like 5 character archetypes we see all over and over again: protagonist, nemesis, mentor, attractor, and trickster. So now in Act 2, what you're doing is you're saying, well, so there's this going on between the protagonist and the mentor character, and da 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 da. But meanwhile, no, you're not necessarily saying mentor. You're just saying between the named character.
Sure.
Meanwhile, the nemesis is doing this. Da 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 da. Well, that leads to the protagonist and now the romance character. Da, da, da. So you're bouncing back and forth between these subplots, and all you're doing is just highlighting about 4 to 6 of these strands of the story leading up to All Is Lost. Understand that they don't need to have everything handed to them.
Of course not.
What they want to know is a flow. And if you can do the flow so that you have these subplots and each one of them is moving your protagonist along in their arc, great. All Is Lost. Then Act 3, man, you're in and out. You want to get to that final struggle as quickly as possible, wrap it up in 2 minutes. 5-5-2. That's what we do. We do a 12-minute pitch, and then you sit back. If they're interested, great. You got all the time for them to, to talk about it afterwards. 3, whatever, how many minutes. If they're not interested, they'll just wish you well and great. So move on with your life. But that's the approach that I use in terms of pitching.
But I'm gathering from this that you have done an enormous amount of your upfront work before you ever think about pitching a story to somebody.
Well, this is where doing stand-up, this may be the only reason why I did stand-up comedy, honestly. You talk about unconscious goal, this may be it. Because when you do stand-up comedy, you know that stuff. You know, if you're doing a routine, you know that word for word, inflection for inflection. And so I tell my writers, you should memorize this. You should go through this thing hundreds of times. Be so comfortable with it that if they interrupt you, which is what you want a conversation, that you're not disrupted and freaked out, that you can drop in and out because you know exactly where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, every writer is different. Here's a tip. You ready?
Sure.
This is a great tip. So this comes from, I have this thing on my blog called dumb little writing tricks that work. So I read this thing, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but David Bowie, the great rock and roller, right?
Yes.
This guy standing backstage with like the manager of David Bowie, the band, there's some stadium thing that, the fans, whatever. Bowie, after the opening acts, Bowie's off in the corner behind the curtain, and he's rocking back and forth like this. And the guy says to the manager, well, what's David doing there? Oh, he does this every show. He's going, I'm David Bowie. I'm David Bowie. I'm David Bowie. He's putting on his persona, the stage persona. So that's what I say. If you're uncomfortable pitching, get in touch with your own stage persona. It's not you. It's the pitch person version of you. So when you go into the meeting, go, I'm David Bowie. I'm David Bowie. And you get in there and you take over the room.
If you get in front of an executive and sing Ziggy Stardust, you're in trouble.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. They may find that entertaining. But that's a little piece of advice.
Well,
Find that pitch persona.
I have been speaking to Scott Myers for a little more than an hour, and I just can't believe how much incredible information we're getting out of you today. It's just fantastic. So we're going to wind this thing down a little bit, and I'm just curious, in all of your experiences in the business of show, can you tell us a story that's either weird, strange, quirky, offbeat, or just plain funny?
Well, okay. So K9, the script that I wrote, the spec script that I wrote,
right,
sold for a lot of money.
And it was your first one, right?
Well, it was my third script, but it was the first. Yeah, that's how I broke into the business. So, I mean, an absurd amount of money, really. But that was back in the day when, scripts were selling for 7 figures and whatnot.
Sure.
Well, I was just destitute. And for the first couple of months, I'm taking meetings and going to meet. Everybody wants to meet you because flavor of the week, because they sold the spec script, doing these meetings and whatnot. And I'm going to meet with my agent because I'm driving around in a Ford Fairmont, like this car that's a wreck. I'm going to these lots, and the guys are like looking at me like, seriously, this is what you're going to come into the lot with? Well, we got all these. So I meet with my agent at the time, Dan Halstead. He's still in the business. He's a very successful manager at this point. And this was at the Hamburger Hamlet in Beverly Hills. I don't think it's there anymore. We're going to meet for lunch. And he was going to hand me the envelope with, I'd gotten a little money, but he was going to hand me the envelope with the big check. This is a 6-figure check. I mean, I knew from the contract, right? So I had 2 meetings. I was staying in Thousand Oaks with a friend, sleeping on his couch. I had 2 meetings that day. I get the check, trying to act real casual. He slides this thing over. I put it in I was wearing a, sports coat or whatever, trying to look cool. I don't know. So now I go to these 2 meetings and I'm like, do I open it? I just had a feeling like I can't really open this thing because it just feels unreal, right? So I'm driving around Hollywood, of course, sweating because my car has no air conditioning. And I'm in these meetings and I'm constantly patting my chest to make sure the check with the envelope, it's still in there.
Hasn't been lifted.
Because I'm like, I don't know. It was such a weird experience coming into the business the way I did. So now I'm driving back to Thousand Oaks to sleep on my friend's couch. And I have it in my head, I should deposit this check. Now, this is at night. The bank's closed. Wells Fargo, that was my bank. But I do know there's a Wells Fargo with a ATM machine in Thousand Oaks. So I pull over and I finally, now this is like 11:30 at night after having spent all day in LA doing all this stuff, the moon shining down, lamplight. I open the envelope and I see this check made to me $100 and some odd thousand. And I endorse it and I put it in the thing and I go and look and I have $200 and some odd in my account and I deposit this check in this ATM machine in the middle of the night in Thousand Oaks. And as soon as it goes in, I'm going, wait a minute, what am I doing? Someone's going to look at this thing and think this is a complete fabrication or something. So then I'm like freaking out that Wells Fargo is not going to, they're going to call me up and think I'm like some sort of shyster or whatever. But anyhow, it went through. But that was such a bizarre experience, staring at this check. Like, you want to hear something funny? So I was on a murder trial in Santa Monica years later.
Oh, murder trials are hilarious.
Yeah, exactly. One of the fellow jurors, we were talking. She said, "Screenwriter, K9. That's Universal, right?" Yeah. She said, "Well, I work in the division at Universal that we sign all the checks. I sign all the checks that come in for over $100,000." I said, "Were you working there in 1987?" She said, "Yeah. You signed my check." You signed my check, and we were like, "Oh yeah."
Well, that is a small world.
Yeah.
That's a crazy small world. Well, those are the stories those are the stories that people read about in the trades and think that everybody's getting that. And the truth is, the overwhelming majority of people never get one of those.
That's true. So there's 2 ways to look at that, Steve. And the reality is that a vast majority of people who write screenplays are not going to have a story like that. I track spec script sales and deals, options and deals on my blog. I have been since 2008 when I started the blog. And, the numbers are very much in decline right now. I mean, like, you're literally talking, I think last year, not even 40 spec script deals, right? That's less than 1 a week.
And out of those 40, how many actually get produced?
Oh, well,
tiny number.
Tiny. Well, that's one thing that people outside of Hollywood have no understanding of, is that there are writers who make very good livings off projects that never get made.
Sure.
Like, I know a writer who's never had a movie made and he lives in a beautiful house,
Mhm.
in the hills and all that. But here's the thing. It's not about the deal necessarily. It's about getting representation. It's about getting the script out to people who then invite you in for meetings so you can get open writing assignments or come in and pitch. So, maybe 40 spec script deals in 1 year, but there are probably hundreds of other situations that have emerged out of there. But on the other hand, Steve, the fact is, I cannot deny that I did this as a complete outsider with no film school background. I sold a spec script and broke into the business. So, it's a very strange, bifurcated type of way of having to think about it.
Well, again, sometimes there's no denying talent one way or another. And you clearly had something going for you, or they wouldn't have talked to you at all. So
something, yeah.
It is intangible. It really is intangible. And you're lucky that you're in that moment at that time where somebody reads it and really likes it, as opposed to you gave it to people and they just didn't care for it. And a good part of it is luck, being in the right place at the right time with the right story that they want at that time. But nevertheless, you just keep moving. You just keep moving forward, or you're like the shark, you're dead in the water if you don't keep moving.
Well, you got to have the material.
Yeah, for sure.
You don't have the material. It's like baseball. You're not swinging at the pitch.
Well, how many people have you met in your life that say, I have a story I want to write, but they don't ever write it?
Tons.
Yeah.
Tons.
So those are the quote unquote wannabes, and they aren't going to succeed by wanting it. You have to actually go do something about it.
Absolutely.
All right. Last question for you today, Scott, and this has just been so much fun. You've already given us all this wonderful advice, but do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give to people who are maybe just starting out, or maybe they're in a little bit and trying to get to that next level?
Well, I guess I'll just go back to that piece of advice, that little mantra I came up with years ago. Watch movies, read scripts, write pages. I mean, I don't, you can do that, and it's entirely possible to break into the business based off of just doing that. But you've got to want it. I mean, you've got to really, really want it. I talk to so many people who say, I just don't have the time. Well, if that's the attitude you have, you're not going to make it. You're just not.
Right.
You got to find the time.
I think
you got to make the time.
That's incredibly sound advice, because it doesn't happen there might be magic in when you're doing the work, but the work doesn't happen by magic. You actually have to work.
So here's a piece of advice, and this didn't come from me. It came from Larry Gordon, who is the producer of K9, Die Hard, 48 Hours. Larry said, if you write a page a day,
Mm-hmm.
that's 2 screenplays in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
You do a month story prep, 4 months to write 120 pages, and a month to rewrite. Then that's 6 months. Then you do that for another. So there really is no excuse. Literally, there's no excuse. It's like, when I was a house dad for the first year of my kids' 1 year to 2 year period. Will, his name's Will. And I found that in 20 minutes, when he took a nap, or 30 minutes, I could pound out a scene. So there's no excuse. I mean, if you have a lunch, spend 30 minutes of it writing. If you're in transit, get your voice memo out and break the scene. Write the scene while you're talking it out. If you really want it, you'll do it. That's it. There's just no other way around it. You've got to make the time, to do it. But you watch movies, you read scripts, you write pages. That's the key to immersing yourself into the business. But then you got to, at the end of the day, put the words on the page.
I think that is just so solid. And I can't thank you enough for doing this today, Scott. This has been just fantastic. And I wish you extremely well with everything you're working on, and you've got a lot going on. And so I'm really grateful for you spending a little more than an hour, almost an hour and 15 minutes here today with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. I love talking about story.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.